Welcome back to your Introduction to Ethics course. This is your video for Unit 3 for theoretical accounts. In this unit, we're going to look at the 3 theories of ethics. So we're going really in the meat of the matter. So we'll cover 4 different theories. The theory of persons, the ethics of person, the ethics of happiness, the ethics of virtue, and the ethics of relationships. Now, if you look into a Introduction to Ethics textbook, you'll see those various views of ethics characterized as such. Duty theory is what Western calls the ethics of person. What Western calls ethics of happiness is traditionally called utilitarianism. Virtue is virtue ethics, and relationship is care ethics. So we'll learn that about 4 different ways to conceive of ethical choices. These 4 different ways of conceive of ethical choices will either prescribe the same ethical choice, so they tell you to do one thing, but give different justifications for it, or even in some cases, many cases, they'll prescribe different ethical choices with different justification. This is to say that these views, these theories, might disagree on what the right thing to do is. Now, it might seem odd to you that theories of ethics might disagree on some issues and prescribe different ethical choices for particular situations. So I'll try to explain what it means to have 4 different theories of ethics. First, all of them are well thought through. This means that they are legitimate views in the philosophical sense. That's one of the main points I've been trying to bring home since the beginning of this class. Not all views are equally acceptable. Inconsistent views are not acceptable, and the same goes for views that are not based on proper evidence and reasoning. Well, the 4 theories of ethics that we are going to study are consistent and well supported. Now, how come they disagree? Well, think about this way. Even in the sciences, when we try to represent a complex system, we use various models to represent different important aspects of the system. These models disagree. None of them is a perfect representation of the system, but each highlights some important aspects of the system. The same goes here. We have various models of ethical choices and ethical behavior. These models disagree. None of them is a perfect representation of the situation, but each captures an important aspect of our ethical lives. Another way of thinking about this is the following. Think of the 4 theories of ethics as 4 different colored lights under which we can look at the situation. The situation stays the same, but the particular ways in which we look at it differs. The situation appears to us, so to say, each time in a different light. Now, by having us looking at the situation in different but systematic ways, the 4 theories of ethics give us an ethical map of the situation. And by doing so, they increase our understanding of that situation. Now, this is probably the most important point I want to bring home in this video, so let me explain a little more. So here it is. Maybe the most important point for today. Philosophy in general, and ethics in particular, do not provide us with unique, perfect answers. They provide us with systematic and coherent ways of thinking about complex situations. Take an issue. Be it abortion, animal welfare, death penalty, or whether you should tell your best friend that their partner is cheating on them. Well, the 4 views of ethics will give you a systematic map of that issue. It tells you what the right thing to do is, depending on what aspect of the situation you take to be the most important. A first distinction is between whether your focus is on conduct or on character. If your focus is on conduct, that is, on which action you should undertake, you will have 2 possible options. If your focus is on the persons involved, the respect you owe to them, and their individual rights, then you'll look into the ethics of person or duty theory. If your focus is on the consequences of your action, on how much good or pleasure you'll bring into the world and how much pain you'll avoid, then you will look into utilitarianism or the ethics of happiness. Now let's go back. If it is not the exact action that you want to figure out, but instead, if your focus is on character, that is the type of person you want to be, then again you have two options. If your focus is on how you can cultivate various virtues to lead a flourishing life, then you'll look into virtue ethics. If finally your focus is on the connections that define you and the responsibilities that derive from those connections, then you'll look into care ethics. Given a certain situation, the four ethical theories give you this map of, depending on what aspect you focus on, what the answer is going to be. I hope it is clear now what I mean when I say that overall, theories of ethics provide us with a conceptual map of the complex ethical situations that made up our lives, and that provide us with greater understanding of those situations. All right, enough of that. So let's go quickly over the four different theories of ethics. Obviously, I'll only scratch the surface here. You'll have to learn more in your textbook during the week. Let us begin with duty theory, or the ethics of person. The fundamental idea that drives this theory of ethics is that persons, that is to say, free rational agents, are autonomous. In other words, they are capable of deciding for themselves. And because of that autonomy, our absolute duty is to respect them for who they are and for the choices they have made. Western includes various philosophers under the category of person ethics. First, you'll read about Buber, Levinas, and some religious views like the Christian view. All of these views have in common the fundamental idea that true encounters with human beings force us to respect them for who they are. In other words, we cannot inflict arbitrary violence to someone we really see as a person. Second comes Kant's duty theory. Kant was a German philosopher during the Enlightenment. He designed a theory of our duty as rational beings towards other rational beings. He argues that our duty ought to follow what he calls the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is an absolute rule for our dutiful conduct. It comes in two versions. The first is that you ought to do. The first version is that you ought to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. What's important, in other words, what this means is that you ought to do only what you can wish that everybody else would do. It has to be universalizable. The second version of the categorical imperative is always act so as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in other, as an end and never merely as a mean. This means that we should never treat others as means to an end only. That doesn't mean that we cannot use people as means at all. That would be impossible. For example, I'm using you, my students, right now to make money. But we should never treat others only as means. In other words, I ought to always keep in mind and act such as to treat you, my students, as ends as well. You are ends in yourself. Finally, Weston talks about Rawls and his veil of ignorance. John Rawls was a very well-known and respected philosopher of the last century. In his main work, A Theory of Justice, he argues that justice in a society can be achieved only if the fundamental principles that rule that society are decided by people under what he calls a veil of ignorance. That is to say, the principles are designed by people who pretend that they don't know which status they'll have in that society. Rich or poor, athlete or disabled, man or woman, black or white, you name it. Rawls argues that under the veil of ignorance, people would come up with two principles. First, the principle of equal liberty, according to which liberty is equally distributed among all, and second, the difference principle, according to which any equality that arises should bring the least well-off persons as far up as any arrangement can. This is not saying that the less well-off should always benefit from the situation. It is that they should, again, be as far up as any arrangement can. We could spend an entire semester on either of those views, certainly on Kant and Rawls. And you'll hear about Kant and Rawls often in your college life, I hope. That said, for now, you'll learn in your textbook, and I'm done for this. Let's move on. So, to summarize what we just did, in the ethics of person, the focus is on person, rational, free being, capable of making their own choices. They have autonomy. That's what it means. Because of that autonomy, we have an absolute duty to give them absolute respect and respect their rights as individuals. This is roughly how the ethics of person works. The focus is on rational beings who are capable of making their own decision, and how you should treat these people as just as for what they are. So before I turn to the ethics of happiness, let me give you an example of how the ethics of person works. Imagine a village, a pretty isolated rural village. There's one shop in there, one shop which sells groceries and everything that people need. Now the shopkeeper, because of her power, could have very high prices. But to make the community a better community, she keeps the prices low. Now, according to the ethics of person, why is that the right thing to do? It's not because of the community happiness. It's not because of our connection to the community. It is because she ought to treat other people in the village with respect. And she ought to do what she can wish everybody else would do in her situation. If you think this way, then you'll realize that the only way she could be acting in a way such that she could wish that everybody would do that if someone were in her position is to keep the prices reasonably low. So the justification here is in terms of respect and in terms of the possibility to universalize the maxim of your action. Let's turn to the ethics of happiness now, or utilitarianism. The fundamental idea that's behind this theory is that your conduct should be whatever maximizes the utility or happiness or well-being for everybody involved. Whether it's utility, happiness, or well-being or pleasure is going to depend on the authors. But the main idea is the same. You need to look at what the consequences of your actions are and how the consequences can be the best in terms of happiness for everybody involved. The philosophers that are behind this view are two philosophers from the 18th century, Bentham and Mill. Bentham was the first one, Mill was his student. For Bentham, who was a radical at the time, fighting for women's rights and also for some labor laws, said that what you ought to do is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That was the simple way to figure out what you needed to do. Mill, when he was his student, thought that pleasure and pain was not refined enough and talked about happiness. Happiness including some higher and lower pleasure, higher and lower pains. So he kind of refined Bentham theory. Now, a contemporary advocate of utilitarianism is Peter Singer. You've read some Peter Singer already. He's got some very controversial views. about animals, about poverty, about other things too. You might have heard of him before. So he's a philosopher at Princeton University. All his radical views are consistently based on the utilitarian view. That is, again, the idea that you have to maximize utility and minimize this utility. The utilitarian calculus is everywhere. You hear about cost-benefit analysis in ecology, in politics, in economics, everywhere. You always think about what are the pluses, the minuses, you balance the plus and the minuses, you decide depending on that calculation. Not everybody thinks that it's always a great way to think about things, and some are critical of the cost-benefit analysis. But one thing is certain is that it has a great influence in our society. Now, if we go to the bookkeeper, that we talked about before. Think again about this village, about her shop, and how she maintains the prices low. Utilitarianism, just as duty theory, is going to tell you that this is the right thing to do. Why is that? Not because she has a duty to do it, because she would want everybody to do the same thing if they were in her situation. It is not about those kinds of overall principles. It is about maximizing the happiness for everybody involved. By keeping the prices low, everybody is more happy when we take everybody into account. Because it maximizes happiness for everybody involved, this is the right thing to do. You see that the two theories do prescribe the same action, keep the prices reasonably low, but do not have the same justification for it. In fact, they have opposite justifications. Let's move on and talk about the ethics of virtue now. The fundamental idea that's behind the ethics of virtue is that you ought to act so that you can flourish as a rational animal. You can fulfill your function in the best way possible. Now, what your function is as a rational animal might be a matter of controversy, but we'll see what Aristotle at least thought our flourishing was made of. But before that, let's look at the founding philosophers. The big one is Aristotle. That's a long time ago, 5th century before the Common Era. Aristotle developed the virtue, what we call now virtue ethics. He was writing a book for Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great was still little. He was his tutor. What he had for ideas is he argued that the way you can be virtuous is by having some kind of moderate emotional response to situations. That's what the theory of the mean is. And that to do that and be truly virtuous, you had to be cultivating your habits in the right kind of way. So virtue is a matter of habits, and it's a matter of having a mean between excess and too little, too much and too little. Now, Western also includes in there Eastern virtues. Confucius talked about harmony in your relationships. Buddha and then the Tao Te Ching talked about detachment and flexibility. And you'll read about that too. Now we'll focus most on virtue ethics. To give you a sense of what virtue ethics became in after those very old philosophers were dead, it's in the 20th century that Elizabeth Anscombe, an American philosopher, said that the views from duty theory and utilitarianism were just too abstract and too universal, and that we needed to refocus on character. And so that's how she brought virtue ethics back to life, even if it had totally disappeared from the philosophical landscape. Right now, it's a very lively view, maybe one of the most lively there is. So what are the main tenets? Well, the main tenets are the following. What is virtue? Well, virtue is to be understood in terms of the function of something. So the virtue of a man or a woman is whatever makes that man or woman do its function well. What is the function of a man and women when they do it well? That's what we call flourishing. So we want to be flourishing human beings. If we were to focus only on flourishing as living beings, then we would just eat and grow. But that's not who we are. We are more than this. Not only are we alive, but we're also moving. We are animals. And as animals, we should not only eat and grow and be living beings, but also we should move around and use our body and physical strength. But we are not only this, according to Aristotle, we're also rational animals. And in order to be a fully flourishing human beings, we need to have really a flourishing that corresponds to rational animals. That means we need to use our reason. Because we use our reason has an effect on our emotional response to the situation. The situation will always call for a particular appropriate emotional response. And practical wisdom is the capacity of taking into account the particulars of the situation in order to have the appropriate emotional response. That response, according to Aristotle, is always a mean between too much and too little. So, for example, courage is have the appropriate emotional response, the appropriate degree of fear. Someone who has no fear whatsoever is not courageous. Someone who has too much fear is not courageous either. So courage is in between the two. Now, that doesn't mean that it always has to be a more moderate response. In fact, there are some situations that call for a lot of fear, or a lot of anger, or a lot of compassion. It all depends on the particulars. There will not be an absolute rule like you have in utilitarianism or in duty theory. It's all about a mean between what is excessive and what is not enough. Now, the last part of it is that appropriate emotional response is something that you have to cultivate through practice and habits. If you want to be virtuous or courageous, you have to practice being courageous. And you'll learn how to do it more naturally every time you do it. Conversely, every time you are vicious, you teach your own mind and body to be vicious. And that means that you're becoming more vicious and more vicious every time. So practice and good habits are the fundamental ways in which we can cultivate virtue. So let's turn to our bookkeeper, or shopkeeper. Again, we've got the village, we've got the shop, and the shopkeeper who is nice enough to keep the prices low. Why should she do that under virtue theory? Not because of a universal rule that tells you either that you ought to respect others and have a universalizable law maxim of your action, not because it maximizes happiness for the community, but because she never abuses her power or neglects her needs. So she is she's acting with a mean, according to a mean between doing too much or too little. She's also genuinely happy to contribute to her community. That is, she has the habit to really do what she ought to do. With practice, she learned how to appreciate what she's doing for what she's doing. So she doesn't abuse her power. That would be not the appropriate way to do it. And she doesn't neglect her needs. She doesn't give away everything she has. But instead, she follows the appropriate mean for the particular situation. Again, keeping the prices low is what is prescribed by virtue ethics, but for very different reasons than the reasons given by duty theory or utilitarianism. All right, last bit. Ethics of relationship, the last of the four theories that we have very briefly covered tonight. Ethics of relationship, or care ethics, which is the traditional name, is a sister of virtue ethics and probably the most recently developed in philosophy. The fundamental idea is the following. It is that awareness of the connections that make us who we are brings a recognition of our responsibility or responsibilities to those things and beings we are connected with. So everything is about the connection you have to others or other things, and how that connection makes you responsible to care for those things and those beings you are connected with. Where does this come from? Well, basically it comes from Carol Gilligan, and now there are many other philosophers behind her, but this is a 20th century philosopher who was the student, and you already read about the story in your book, the student of Kohlberg, who had some ideas about the stages of moral development, basically his theory was that girls were morally developing at a lower rate or an inferior rate than boys. Carol Gilligan was a student of Kohlberg, and she designed a theory that was going against her teachers' views, and according to which girls really are not inferior in terms of the stages of moral development in comparison to boys, but they follow a different path and they have a different voice, and that's the title of her most important book. So here again, to scratch only on the surface, we could also do an entire semester on care ethics. To scratch just the surface, here's how it works, or how care ethics works. The idea is that we are all born and embedded in connections with each other, with other beings, with the environment, with tons of the other things and beings. We are connected. Because of those connections, be it to your parents or to the tree in your backyard, or to the mountains or the ocean, or animals, or your children or your community, all those connections, if you are aware of them, appropriately aware of them, then you recognize that you have some kind of responsibility towards the things and beings you are connected with. So again, this idea is that through the awareness of connection, you have also an awareness, a recognition of responsibility. And the person you want to be is the person who really acts depending on that responsibility. So you will care for whatever you are connected with in a strong and important way. So those were the basics of care ethics. See, if we go back to our good shopkeeper, here again, according to care ethics, she's going to do the right thing, which is she's going to behave in the right kind of way, which is that she's going to keep her prices low. Not because she would want everybody to do the same thing if someone else was at her place, not because it will bring the most happiness to the village, not because she wants to be a virtuous person, but because she feels that she's connected with her community, with all the people in her community, and that because she recognizes that connection to the community, she acts accordingly to the responsibility she has towards that community, which is to keep her prices low. Now we have I have presented the most important tenets of each of the 4 theoretical accounts that are available on the ethical theory market, if you wish. The ethics of person is the ethics that describes your absolute duty to respect rational beings as autonomous, as able to make their own choices, rational choices. The ethics of happiness worries about the consequences of your actions. And it says that the universal rule for your action is really about maximizing utility, happiness, or well-being for everybody involved. Everyone involved. The ethics of virtue ethics, doesn't give you a rule for what kind of action you should be doing, but really focuses on your character and says that to be a good person, a virtuous person, you need to cultivate some virtues, and that virtues are being a virtuous is acting and being the kind of person that is flourishing as a rational animal. And in order to do that, you need to apply reason to your emotions, which brings you to have a certain kind of appropriate emotional response to a particular kind of situations. And finally, care ethics, or the ethics of relationships, tells you that you have you are born or you are in connection with other people and other things, or other beings and other things. And because of those relationships, those connections, you have some responsibilities towards those things, beings, and people. Now you remember that all those 4 views are very well argued for. They're very well supported. They're based on good reasoning. then none of them are perfect. There are some counterexamples where the result is counterintuitive and doesn't seem to work well. There are some discussions among scholars between those different views, but all of them have a strong support system, if you want, a strong reasonings behind them to argue that this is one appropriate way, legitimate way to look at our ethical lives. As I said at the beginning, none of them is perfect, which means that none of this gives you the perfect, unique, absolute answer. What it gives you, as I said before, is a map a mapping tool for ethical issues. That is, it allows you to understand ethical issues in a certain way. That is, as what if I focus on this? What if I focus on this? So again, remember, if you focus on the kind of action, the kind of conduct you ought to be, then we have these two rules. One about respect for individuals and their rights, for persons, individuals, and their rights. The other one on consequences for everybody involved. If you focus on the kind of person you want to be, on the kind of character, then one is telling you about how to be a virtuous, cultivating virtue. The other one is telling you about how taking responsibility for the kind of beings, things, beings, and persons you are connected with. Now, the example I gave you earlier, the good shopkeeper, is an example in which all four views come to the same conclusion. The shopkeeper should keep her prices low for the community, for different reasons every time. So you saw how it was shedding different lights, giving different justifications, different types of justification for the same result. Now, there are some issues on which the four accounts disagree, and typically this is a question for which they disagree. Is it ever morally acceptable to lie? There are many others, but this is a particularly striking one. Is it ever morally acceptable to lie? So think about the example I took earlier. Your best friend has a partner, boyfriend or girlfriend, and you learn that this person is cheating on her or him. Should you tell her or not, or should you tell him or not? So that's a legitimate question. That's an ethical issue, an ethical dilemma, and there are some considerations, different considerations depending on the theory you consider. So if you think in terms of action, then again you have two choices. You can think, what if you think in terms of the respect you have for your best friend. So your best friend is an autonomous agent. She's able to make her own choices. She's responsible for her choices, and you should respect her for who she is as an autonomous agent. So according to this, you should not lie to her, because that would not be being respectful towards her autonomy. Similarly, if you take the first formulation of the categorical imperative, you could not be wishing that everybody lies. So it is an inconsistent behavior. You cannot universalize your maxim of action if you decide to lie, which means that lying is just plain wrong in all cases. This is how radical this view is. So what it tells you is that if you take really the view that persons are autonomous agent, and that because of that your absolute duty is to respect them as autonomous people, then it is never okay to lie. On the other hand, if you look at happiness, or the ethics of happiness, well, it all depends on your calculation of what will make her, the rest of the community, her boyfriend or girlfriend, and yourself, and everybody involved, and their families, the most happy. So you have to take into account all those consequences and see which one of those choices brings the most happiness. It might be the case that, this little blurb in the relationship is really not worth the happiness that everybody is going to get out of the relationship staying the way it is. While you know that if you tell your best friend that she's been cheated on, then she'll break that relationship, which otherwise could have been a very fulfilling one for everybody involved. On the other hand, you could know that she's already unhappy, and that she'll continue to be unhappy, and that there are other reasons why other people are unhappy. Maybe someone else is in love with her and would be very happy if that relationship would go down the drain. So you might want to precipitate the relationship down the drain, even if it's not because of the respect you have for your friends, but because, again, your calculation that the most happiness is going to come out of your action. Now, those two rules, in this case, you see that even if it implies lying to your best friend or possibly lying about someone being guilty, it all depends on what the overall happiness is going to be for everybody involved. So that ethics could justify some lying, some scapegoating, or other things if the consequences are in a certain particular configuration. On the other side, if you think about character, now you're not looking for absolute rules for your conduct, but you're looking for the kind of person you want to be. So here you're going to look either at virtue or care. If you look at virtue, you look at the kind of person you want to be. You know that every time you do something which is vicious, you are getting more vicious. And lying is most of the time not a good thing to do. So you're presumably going to keep as much truth as possible. You don't want to be a full liar. Telling all the truth is not always very good. You always have cases in which you have to have a happy middle ground between telling all the truth and telling lies. And that's how you're going to be the wisest person with the most practical wisdom. On the other hand, if you think in terms of ethic of care, well, how much do you care about your best friend, and what does it mean in terms of a responsibility you have towards her, towards the way she thinks about her relationship, about her life? Is she intending to get married? In which case, all those things could be different. Again, you are going to think about the connection you have with her and what it means in terms of your responsibility to her, and maybe to your boyfriend, maybe to her boyfriend or girlfriend. Maybe there is something here that's important. Maybe you have a special relationship with her grandmother, who would really suffer from not seeing her granddaughter flourishing in the right kind of way if you were not to tell the truth. So you see how those different theories could possibly give you different answers when it comes to telling lies or not. What's interesting here is that, to me at least, what I find the most interesting is that by thinking this way, when you have conflicts in your head, oh, should I do this? Should I do that? Oh, but that will make her miserable. But at the same time, I really owe her the truth. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that's not a dilemma that is totally ununderstandable. That moral dilemma between the respect you owe to your best friend and the bad consequences of telling the truth, these can be captured by an opposition between two strong aspects of our ethical lives. And to me, what philosophy does is precisely to give you this map and bring clarity to the situation. When you have a dilemma like this, you understand that really your question is not everything clumped together, but it's about the different ways in which we can think about our ethical lives. And that brings understanding. It might not bring the perfect answer to your question, but it will bring clarity to the problem. So that's the sense in which I think that ethical theories are mapping tools. They don't give you the absolute truth about theories. And by the way, some people do think, and some people are fully utilitarian or fully Kantian or fully Aristotelian or fully full advocates of care ethics. But to me or for you, I think it's better to think of ethical theories as a toolbox that gives you a sense of how we can map issues in a systematic, coherent way, so that we understand our own discussions, internal discussions, or between each other, our discussion between each other when we are discussing some ethical issues. So I hope it makes sense for you, to you, and I wish you have a good time. I wish you a good time when you read more about those different views of ethics, and I want you to keep that in mind, that none of them, to me at least, are bringing you a full-blown answer, but all of them bring some clarity to the complex situations in which we find ourselves in our ethical lives.